Okay, welcome back. Today we're going to be doing the poem Tissue by Imtiaz Dharker. We're going to talk a little bit about Dharker as a poet, and then I'm going to go through and analyse the poem. Just a reminder of the codes, the highlighter code that we use. We're looking at word analysis, generalised language analysis, like devices, anything structural that we can look at, and then any ideas about power or conflict or other themes in the cluster. And those are the 4 highlighters we're going to use, but if you want to use your own ones, if you're in another class, for example, that's fine. But my class, we're using these. I probably should make a comment about what you'll see about tissue, or what you hear about tissue if you speak to students in year 11. Tissue is a great poem, and Imtiaz Dharker is a great poet. But this poem has got a bit of a bad reputation in the cluster, generally because people find it a little bit difficult and a bit strange, and find it difficult to link to other poems. I'm hoping when I go through it today it'll be relatively simple, but bear in mind that a lot of people believe that this poem won't come up in the exam. We don't know that for definite. You have to learn all 15 poems. So it won't be one that we majorly focus on, mainly because there's not loads that you can link to for it. I will go through a few that you can link to, but it's not a really flexible poem like, for example, the Emigre, or a poem like Exposure, where you can link to pretty much everything. So just bear that in mind. And the whole poem is an extended metaphor, which is probably why, and there's no narrative, there's no story to it. And that's probably why people find it a bit harder. But we're gonna, hopefully it's gonna make sense within the next 20 minutes as I go through it. So let's get going. We'll start by talking about Imtiaz Dharker. She's quite an interesting individual. So she was born in Pakistan, but grew up in Scotland, and a lot of her poetry explores ideas about the world and in particular identity. Now last year, 2019, she was actually offered, she was in the running, she was being considered for the next role, the next poet laureate. So hopefully you know from when we did War Photographer that Caroline Duffy was the first female poet laureate, and she was for some time. In 2019, Dharker was one of the names that was being considered to be poet laureate, and she actually came out and said she didn't want to have the role, because as poet laureate you have to write like poems for the country, poems that, like, for example, the Queen will ask you, in theory, or the government will ask you to write poems about certain things that happen. And she basically didn't want her poetry to be, the poetry that she felt she wanted to write, to be kind of sidelined in order to write poems for the country. So she kind of came out and said she wasn't interested in the role. And in the end it went to Simon Armitage, who's also a really good poet, and we'll read one of his poems, Remains. It's in the cluster, and he's always been one of the poems that has been studied at GCSE. So she's quite interested in that way, because she wasn't interested in this really kind of famous role, quite a significant role. I think makes her quite interesting. Now, this poem was published in 2006 in a collection called The Terrorist at My Table, which also includes a poem that used to be on the GCSE, which is called The Right Word, which is a really good poem. It's worth looking it up to get a bit of a flavour of what her poems are like. A lot of teachers prefer The Right Word from the old GCSE. I'm not going to say whether I do or not, but it is a good poem to go and look at. Now, The Terrorist at My Table is essentially a collection that explores relevant modern issues about who people are, so their identities. Do we really know the people that we live with, the people that we meet, and how we're afraid and how we question other people, and kind of ideas about humanity and identity. It's a great collection. but it is worth having a little look at the right word. It'll give you a good indication of what type, kind of poetry. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the poem. I'm going to talk you through it, what it's about, and the kind of extended metaphor. So if we start with a structural comment. Now this opening line essentially gives us a little summary of what the poem's about. So she kind of gives us a bit of a summary straight away, which is an interesting way. It's always good to look at how a poem begins and ends. It's often a good indication of what the poem is going to be about. So this is kind of a summary of the message of the poem. Which is, what she's saying is that paper lets light shine through, and that yet this is something that can alter things. So, paper is fragile and transparent, but we give it a lot of power. Which is probably a summary of what the poem's about. Okay, so paper, and therefore by linking that tissue, and we'll come back to the reason that she uses the word tissue as a title rather than paper when we get to the end. But that's what the poem's about. Okay, so paper, this is used in lots of different ways, and we give it a lot of power, and it holds a lot of power in our society, but it's actually quite fragile. So the first example that she talks about, I've just realised I haven't read the poem through, so I've gone straight in with that first line. So what I'll do is I'll read from here on, and then I'll come back and pick bits out. So I've already read that first line, but we'll go from the start. Paper that lets the light shine through, this is what could alter things. Paper thinned by age or touching, the kind you find in well-used books, the back of the Quran, where a hand has written in the names and histories, who was born to whom, the height and weight, who died where and how, on which sepia date, pages smoothed and stroked and turned transparent with attention. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift in the direction of the wind. Maps too. The sun shines through their borderlines, the marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds, fine slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. An architect could use all this, place layer over layer, luminous script over numbers, over line, and never wish to build again with brick or block, but let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths. Through the shapes that pride can make, find a way to trace a grand design with living tissue, raise a structure never meant to last, of paper smoothed and stroked and thin to be transparent, turned into your skin. Okay. When you read it over, it does sound a bit weird and a bit strange. So I'll carry on working through it and hopefully try and make sense of it. So we've got this little summary at the start. What we then move to is paper as religious texts. Okay, what we'll do is we'll just make a little note of kind of what's going on in each stanza. So she's talking about the power here that we give to not just the Quran in particular, but religion in general. So they are well-used books. Okay, so she's making a valid point here. Religious books hold a lot of power, hold a lot of weight and control. Religious books hold power, despite the fact that they can be thinned by age or touching. So there's these constant references. I'm going to do it in yellow for a word analysis. There's a constant reference to how paper is fragile. I'm going to put fragility of paper and how it doesn't last, essentially. What it then goes on to is records of humans. So it talks about names, histories, who was born, where, height and weight, who died, where and how. So we're talking about like, I'm going to put life records. But essentially there are pieces of paper that record all these things. We get birth certificates, we get death certificates, marriage certificates. When you're born, you know, it's recorded how big you are, how much you weigh, etc. So that's another kind of thing that we allow paper to have power. Paper holds power over life and death. So you probably don't know this, but a baby, when it's born, has to be registered, and its birth has to be registered, and you get a certain amount of time to do it, and if you don't, then essentially that baby doesn't exist, in theory. So that's another way we give paper this kind of strange power that she's talking about. Now the next bit is quite interesting. She talks about pages smoothed and stroked and turned transparent. There's an interesting, this is a key quotation, there's lots of interesting things on here. We've got this list of 3 verbs, smoothed and stroked and turned, and we've got this polysyndeton, which is essentially the repetition of and. So it should be pages smoothed, comma, stroked and turned. But this idea, this repetition of and is showing us how all these things are happening to paper. And we've also got the enjambment of the line running on from one to the next. Okay, now we wouldn't just list devices, so we're going to talk about them. What these 3 things tell us is there's varying things obviously that you can say for each device, but we're going to talk generally. They're talking about the ongoing handling of paper, which leads to its fragility. So these verbs are all to do with the fact that we constantly handle this paper, whether it's a religious text or whether it's records. They're smoothed, it's stroked, it's turned, and then what happens to it is it becomes transparent, so it becomes see-through. So we give it power, and yet light can break through it, or it can thin. So that list of 3, and the polysyndeton and the enjambment, it's all to do with it being ongoing, so it's constant. I'm going to put constant / ongoing handling of paper, which is shown by these ands, and then the fact that the line runs on to the next one. In this next stanza, it refers to buildings becoming paper, and how if they were paper, they would fall away easily, which is a valid point. So again, showing that it's not got the strength perhaps that we think it has. What is interesting to note here is this modal verb might. Now, a modal verb is something that indicates either certainty or uncertainty, or possibility. Now, she uses lots of these throughout the poem. I'll try and I'll point them out as we go along with the yellow for the word analysis. But she's kind of, what she's doing is she's showing that all these ideas are kind of uncertain or tentative. She's not quite sure about this kind of idea that we give paper so much power. And these are all things that you could do or you might do if you kind of give power to paper. Again, you've got if at the start, which is interesting. Now in the next bit, she's talking about maps and borders. So another way that we give paper power is we use it to map out lines of countries and to divide things, which she kind of sees as ironic. She says that the sun shines through their borderlines, which there's loads of ways to unpick that. It's a quite kind of figurative phrase. If we talk about it to do with power and conflict, it's quite interesting that she talks about borderlines, like divisions between countries. So we use, we give borders on maps but they are fragile, or maybe they're unnecessary is what she's saying, because because, you know, lights can just shine through it. So you think that you've mapped everything out and you think that you've separated countries, but things are a lot more blurred than that. She's then got this interesting list about the marks that we put on maps, so rivers, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds. It's kind of an asyndetic list. It lacks the final connective that you should put on the end of a list. So again, it's this ongoing sense of division or divides that we give on a map. You know, we mark out rivers, we mark out roads, we mark out rail tracks, we mark out mountains, but the sun can shine through a map. So why do we give it so much power? Why do we give it control? The next one, she moves on to kind of money and economy with reference to receipts. So she talks about fine slips from grocery shops. So there she's talking about receipts that obviously hold power because they show transactions, they show amounts that you pay for things, and what we paid by credit card. But then she uses this really interesting simile where she compares receipts, grocery shops, fine slips, to kites. So she's saying that receipts and paper is so fragile that it can kind of like fly away, which is a valid point. And yet we use receipts and we use invoices and records of money to show quite important things, to show, you know, how much we spent on something, or whether we're owed that money. And actually she's saying that can just fly away. So how much power should we be giving it? Is it as significant as we think it should be? So I'm just going to put here power we give to money, which is a valid point, to be fair. And then again we've got this modal verb, this kind of unsure right down there, this might, indicating again that lack of certainty. It's something that could happen. These slips, these receipts could just fly away because they don't have much power. What then happens is it all gets a bit strange. She starts to talk about how you could, if paper has that much power and strength, an architect could use it to build. It kind of goes back to that stanza here where she's saying, well, if buildings were paper, we could just knock them over, they could fall easily. And now she's saying that architects could use it. So I'm just gonna again reference that modal verb there, because it would be a stupid thing, as we all know, I think, to use paper to build something. But she's saying people could if we give it lots of power. Then this bit here is quite interesting. She's basically saying we never have to build again with brick or block, and we could let the daylight break through. Capitals and monoliths, these are kind of structures of strength, strong structures. Now let is an interesting imperative verb, but I think she's kind of being ironic here. I don't think she actually wants daylight to break through. But this is interesting because it's showing nature's power. So there's constant references to sunlight and the transparency of paper. And here she's saying, well, let that daylight break through all these buildings, all these structures. Now, this is where it gets to a bit more of an extended metaphor, which I'll explain in more detail. What she then talks about is paper becoming living tissue. Now, tissue is obviously polysemous because you've got the tissue of paper But what you've also got is skin tissue, okay? Now this is where the extended metaphor gets taken a whole step further. She talks about raising a structure never meant to last. Now whether she's talking about a building or what she might be talking about here is people. We raise people that are never meant to last, and we give power to humans who are eventually going to fade. She then repeats, so this is an interesting structural thing, she repeats something from earlier on in the poem. She talks about smoothed and stroked and thinned to be transparent, as opposed to pages smoothed and stroked and turned transparent. There's a lot more certainty here. So it's kind of a repetition, although it's slightly changed, of line 11. But it's become more certain. So we've again got this list of three. We've got the enjambment again. We've got the polysyndeton again. So it's structurally quite similar to what's happening in lines 11 and 12. But it's much more certainty here. It will be transparent. And then finally, she says, turned into your skin. Okay, so that's when she's basically saying that the same thing happens to our skin tissue, is that our skin fades away and it becomes thinned by age as well. And then this is where the poem becomes much more complex. So what we've got is paper / tissue, and that's what she's talking about. And what she's saying is that paper and tissue, and skin, etc. So paper and tissue is fragile, but has power. Okay, and that's what the whole metaphor of the poem is. Look at all these objects that we give power to, and it's just paper. It can fly away, it can fall off, it can fall away, it will thin, it will turn transparent, it will fade away. And then what she says is, right, I've said all that about paper. Paper is also tissue, and tissue is also skin. So what she's saying there is that humans are also made of tissue, of paper, and therefore what she's doing is making that connection that humans are also fragile, but we give them power. So in a sense, the poem becomes about the power we give paper, but also the power we give people, even though we're quite fragile and we're not meant to last. So in a sense, the poem then becomes about the kind of fragility of human power and how human power is never meant to last. So the obvious poem that links with that, and we'll just do the links down here. I don't know why I've made the box so big, because there's not that many. Big title. The most obvious link that I think with this poem is Ozymandias. Both are about human power not lasting, or not being made to last. In that sense, then, it also links to My Last Duchess, where he thinks he has human power, but he doesn't really. And you can argue that tissue is kind of similar to that. We think we have power, but we don't. We're actually quite fragile, much like paper, much like tissue. This is also kind of a poem about identity, though, and understanding the self and understanding humans. I know that's a bit deep, maybe, and a lack of human power. And in that sense, there are links to the poems that we're looking at the moment. So London shows a real lack of human power, The Emigre, and Checking Out My History. But we'll put London down for the similar thing to Ozymandias. Humans lack power. Okay. Just under 25 minutes to go through that poem, which I don't think is that bad. I know it's a weird one, okay? I would focus mostly your ideas on this idea here. Okay, so paper is fragile. Paper and tissue are fragile. We give them power, We're made up of tissue, skin tissue, which means we are also fragile and have no power. And that's the kind of like extended metaphor of the poem. And then if you reread the poem with the thought that she's also talking about humans and the power we have being quite fragile, then that's kind of what it's about. Excellent. Hopefully that helped. Hopefully you got all those annotations down. And see you soon.